Okay, so we're shifting gears now to thinking about globalization in the financial sphere. And I guess I took this opportunity to kind of look forward and think about what are the challenges. Of course, we have the continued issues of preserving financial market stability and making sure that our banking systems are resilient. But as I thought about this, it seemed to me that we're going to be doing all of this business as usual kind of work in financial markets in the face of increasing risks. And what do I mean by this? Well, I think looking forward, and now I'm talking really big picture, I think we have some sort of global risks that are going to be challenging markets in general and financial markets in particular. Of course, climate change is front of mind. You can't open the paper without confronting some new story about some major way that climate issues are having an economic impact. We also have just been through a pandemic. It seems unlikely that's the last pandemic we are going to confront. And we also have increased political risk. And the thing is, these risks aren't uncorrelated. The risks themselves are somewhat correlated. It appears that climate change itself could be contributing to increased risk of disease transmission. And all of these pressures increase the risk of continued political conflict. So not only are these risks correlated, but they are correlated across countries. They're also really challenging risks in the sense that they're very large tail risks, in the sense that they're hard to forecast. Many of these things are sort of out of sample. We haven't seen these kind of risks before, and they have very large consequences. So that poses a real challenge. There's also substantial policy uncertainty, the magnitude to which climate change is going to have an economic impact, the magnitude to which political conflict is going to have an economic conflict depends on the policies we choose ex ante to prevent these crises. And given that, it's hard to know what these ultimate risks will be. And I think the final thing I would point to on this list, although I'm sure it's not an exhaustive list, is that there are significant spillovers and externalities. So the policy choices in one country are going to have significant implications for other countries. And I think we all know, I'm going to focus a bit on climate change. There's so many facets to this, but just to focus on one thing, this is just showing the percent change in GDP from an increase in global temperatures up to 3 degrees Celsius. And you can see the implications are large, they're long lasting. They're also asymmetric. So one thing that we know is that the largest impact will be on countries near the equator. These are countries that tend to be poorer. And so we see this uneven impact of warming across the globe. Of course, temperature isn't the only impact of climate change. We anticipate greater severity of natural disasters. It's going to redistribute where rainfall and access to fresh water is around the world. We're already seeing evidence of increased magnitudes of both droughts and floods. This is going to have an impact on agricultural production. It's also going to put real pressure on migration, both within countries and across national borders. So I think, once you pull the lid off of thinking about the impacts of climate change, one can't help but get depressed. The news the magnitude of these issues just seems really large. And the final thing on this list is that with climate change, there's growing evidence that this is going to lead to greater potential for disease spread, that the potential for diseases to spread from one type of species to another. Recent article in Nature suggests that an increase in cross-species transmission of about 4,000%, even if we keep temperature increases to under 2 degrees Celsius. Now, all of this is pointing to a greater need for global cooperation. We're all in this together to a greater or lesser extent. And I think if the past is prologue, we have some reasons to be thinking that maybe to be concerned. I mean, after all, we just went through this large shock, as Paul pointed out. It had a huge impact on trade, huge impact on economic activity. And now we're dealing with the aftermath. Even if, as we're still coming out of the COVID pandemic, we've seen an increase in global debt of 26% of world GDP. Countries did a lot of things to help mitigate the impact of COVID, but this has left us with a large overhang of debt worldwide. This is both private and public debt. We see continued disruption of global supply chains. As Paul pointed out, it looks like there is some recovery in that dimension and maybe some optimism there. We also know, of course, we're dealing with inflation in the post-COVID period. I think there were glimmers of cooperation that we saw during the COVID pandemic, greater risk sharing occurring structurally in Europe. We saw vaccine development and distribution. So this was really a global effort, and there were big spillovers there. But we also see increased conflict as well. So this is a talk about financial markets. So what's the connection between all of this and financial markets? Well, I think, financial markets are going to be key to helping do the kind of sustained investment and to leverage resources so that we can undertake the very large investment in infrastructure that's needed, both ideally with extensive private buy-in. Now that's going to require policies that have incentives to tilt public investment toward some of this climate mitigation investment. So that's ex ante. Ex post, as these crises occur, as we see the effects of climate events, we need to manage what to do with defaults, what to do in the event that cities, states, countries can't repay. Firms find themselves in a situation where they've undertaken investments, but nonetheless, given the impact of these climate shocks, they're unable to pay their debts. And so somehow we're going to need mechanisms for identifying climate risk as an exogenous risk, and think about mechanisms for building in clauses into debt contracts, and to think about environments or situations, policies where we allow for debt forgiveness following climate shocks. What this means is that we're also going to need to be measuring these risks. And I think we're still pretty much at the infancy stage of doing this. We need to think about, I know there's been work, Bank of England has been at the forefront of this. I know the IMF and the World Bank are working on this, but I think it's still at the early stages to think about how we both measure exposure to risks and how we induce debtors to disclose their exposure to climate risks. And another piece that affects financial markets is how to manage the very large valuation changes that are likely to occur. This happens both along the transition as we move from being a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy. There are going to be winners and losers along that path. But it's also going to continue in the new equilibrium where we will have large shocks that happen, and there will be large valuation changes coming from that. And so I think these are going to be large shocks that affect and will need to be working through financial markets. So, what are the solutions? Global institutions are already beginning to work on this. I have to say, as I started to have started to do more reading in this area, it's amazing to me how slow I think academic research is on this. We've had some folks have been working on this for a while. Of course, we have the area of natural resources where they're working on very specific problems. But from the perspective of kind of global risk, there's not a lot of work. And I think there are many, many important issues here, thinking through how much of this risk is systemic versus how much of it is idiosyncratic or location specific, thinking through what contracts look like if they involve ex-ante risk sharing versus the ex-post revaluations that are likely to occur, thinking through who the likely winners and losers are. There's a recent paper by Crucell and Smith. I'm sure it's not the last word on this, but really with a global model that really tries to take into account these underlying risks and then work through under different kinds of financial market structures, what are the redistributions that happen in that kind of framework. So that's just one approach, but I think there is room for a lot more work to be done. And I have to say, I was the editor of the IMF Economic Review for a while, and we actually put out a call for papers. We wanted to have sessions on climate risk, and frankly, it was hard to get submissions. So I guess this is partly a call to this group. I think this is really an area that is ripe for work, and I hope that more people become interested in doing it. And finally, the last thing on my list is measuring and pricing these externalities. I think there's just so much work to do in this area. So I will stop there. Hopefully this will be a spur on more conversation.